The fall of the SPD, in particular the Social Democratic Party, has been quite spectacular in recent years. You will see exactly what you see in France and in Britain and in the US as well, that people are turning towards right-wing populist parties. It was interesting to hear the response to Vance's speech.
I believe that dismissing their concerns is the most surefire way to destroy democracy.
There was outrage amongst kind of journalists and other intellectuals, and then more ordinary people said, well, he was right, I feel he spoke for me.
Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked. I'm delighted to be joined today by German historian and journalist Katja Hoyer. Welcome, Katja.
Hello.
You've written several books about Germany. You're a historian of Germany, most recently Beyond the Wall and Blood and Iron. But I wanted to talk to you mostly about the upcoming federal elections this week. It looks as if the ruling Social Democratic Party is going to suffer from historic losses. Judging by the polls, every partner in the coalition is polling below the conservative CDU and also the right populist AfD. I mean, how has it gone so wrong so quickly for this government, do you think?
I'm not sure it was that quick, to be honest. I mean, Olaf Scholz, the current German chancellor, sort of ran on a post-Merkel ticket, if you will. So, he even did the famous sort of Merkel diamond shape, sort of gesture that was her trademark in the build up to the election. So what he promised really was to perpetuate a system that was already on its way out and down. Angela Merkel had, despite her personal approval ratings being fairly stable, she'd actually got some of the worst results for the CDU, for her political party, already since the Second World War. And so I think really what's happened was that Germany sort of chose the least bad option at the time, or that's what it thought it was doing. And then on top of that, you had the war in Ukraine, you had the COVID pandemic and all the fallout from that, in terms of high inflation and things like that. So really he was trying to, move forward on a system that was already, quite unpopular. And then on top of that, you had a lot of crises. So I don't think it was necessarily unexpected as such, certainly not for political observers. But the fall of the SPD, in particular the Social Democratic Party, has been quite spectacular in recent years, and has now reached a historical low. You'd have to go back to the 19th century to see sort of results this bad for them if nothing changes between now and the election.
And one thing that a lot of international observers will be looking at is the rise of the AfD. It's gone from about 10% to around 20%, according to most polls. There have been lots of attempts to contain this party. They've even been calls to ban it. Why have those efforts been so unsuccessful?
I think because they were fighting a symptom of an underlying sense of disaffection and disappointment that is there, and by fighting that symptom, you're not really addressing the reason why it's there in the first place. So there were lots and lots of Germans who were deeply unhappy with Angela Merkel's response to the refugee crisis in 2015 in particular, and the sort of scale of immigration that we've seen since. I should also add that this is quite different to what is going on, say, in the UK, for example. So where here there's a debate around immigration going on as well, but it's largely labour migration coming to the UK. So there's an argument there that's too high, but we're still talking about people who were legally coming into the country on work visas and things like that, and the associated problems are more to do with resources and things like that. Whilst in Germany, what people are objecting to is a sort of lack of control. The government just doesn't know who's in the country, and it's quite open about that. And it sort of says, well, we opened the borders then, and we don't really want to close them because of, freedom of movement within Europe, and also because they think it would take up too many resources. But the argument is basically we don't really know who's here and we can't do anything about that. And that's what's frustrating people. And when you then respond to that by saying we're going to try and hem in, the party that basically offers people to do something about that, how realistic that is, we can discuss that. That's not really the point. The point is that they're channeling some of that disaffection and the anger that comes out of that. So I'm not surprised that, when you kind of tackle the problem from the back end, really, that this doesn't really work, because people will find a way of making that discontent heard. And that's what's been happening.
And it seems that recently we've just had a terror attack in Munich, a string of terror attacks, in fact, across Germany. Also, recently in just this year, Aschaffenburg, where a young child was stabbed by what appears to be an asylum seeker. Does this is this playing into the AfD's election campaign? This string of terror attacks, often related to Islamism or to asylum seekers.
I think it is, but it hasn't led to a recent spike in their support as far as the polls are concerned. So it's not like, they were sort of on 10% in December and then suddenly it went up massively. That's been an ongoing thing. I think what's been happening with these recent attacks, also the Christmas market attack that we've seen in December in Magdeburg, was more that people felt confirmed in some of their fears and some of their, the way that they felt about the political non-response to this in the first place. But it doesn't seem to have led to a recent increase. I think it's more that those people who were already inclined to vote AfD, feel even more outraged. But there's also a wider sense in society now that the political parties should do something about this. So we've seen movement even within the two main the former main parties, the Social Democrats and the CDU, CSU, going in the same sort of direction, trying to channel some of the, concerns that people have into their own parties. So I think the overall effect has been that the debate has changed and the topic of debate has shifted towards immigration rather than, this immediately benefiting the AfD.
In the longer run, one of the striking things about support for the AfD is how much stronger it seems to be in East Germany compared to West Germany. What do you think explains that split?
I mean, to me, this has always been a bit of a red herring, because people have been talking about this for years and years, and they've always, particularly in Germany, seen this as almost like a sort of late consequence of the dictatorship experiences that people have had in the sort of during the Cold War by not living in a democracy. So the argument ran, people aren't used to democracy, therefore they're voting for non-democratic parties. And I've always argued, this is just East Germans doing it more quickly than West Germans, but if you give it enough time, you will see exactly what you see in France and in Britain and in the US as well, that basically people are turning towards kind of right-wing populist parties, not because they are educated or they were raised and educated in a dictatorship, but because there are underlying factors at play. In my view, the differences between East and West are the same that we see in those other countries, namely that it's working class people voting for them. And that's what we have seen indeed with Donald Trump, also with Brexit, with in the UK, with the sort of disgruntled northern vote in particular, that people are trying to find a new outlet basically for their discontentment with the status quo. And in East Germany, because of the way that it was a socialist state for so long, so basically people weren't able to accumulate private wealth, buy houses, basically become middle class. You have a much, much greater proportion of the population is working class. And if you break it down along those lines, you saw last year, for instance, during the European elections in June, that the AfD won the working class vote across Germany, roughly with the same amount of people, about a third of the population, which is currently where in East Germany the vote is for the AfD. So I think this has always had kind of class and kind of demographic reasons rather than being coming out of that history, out of that split of Germany into East and West.
And this weekend at the Munich Security Conference, JD Vance, the US Vice President, chastised Europe for its attitude to free speech. Do you think that people in Germany feel a sense that there are things that they're not allowed to say, that certain topics are considered taboo by the political class, and might that have certain resonances with East Germany in a way, although obviously we don't want to go to that extreme and accuse them of being Stasi-like, but Do you think there are some resonances there?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't go that far, but that's certainly what I hear a lot. I mean, I've just come back from Germany literally just, last night. And I spent some time in the East doing public events with, people from Eastern Germany sort of attending them, and the anger is just immense. And what you hear a lot from people is exactly that comparison. So people say, for instance, in Germany, you're now encouraged to use kind of gender-specific language to describe a group of people. So you're always supposed to kind of say men and women, or to use an example in English grammar that makes sense is sort of if you were addressing a group of actors, you'd have to say actors and actresses. And in Germany, in German, there's kind of a male and a female version of almost every word. And so you were encouraged to kind of use that sort of, additional grammatical, sort of language for everything that you say. And people hated it, and people still hate it. There's about, every survey that you look at, people say it's complete nonsense. When I talk to a group of actors, I just say actors rather than actors and actresses. And that sort of thing, basically, people say reminds them of East Germany. So they will say, then you were required to use different language in public to the way that you'd speak at home. You'd kind of have to show your political stance or your political opinion by speaking in a certain way, in the way that kind of the authorities demanded of you. So these kinds of things are always incredibly sensitive. They do trigger memories in people of kind of having a public sphere and a private sphere, and the way that you have to keep the two apart. So to me, it was interesting to hear the response to Vance's speech as well in the East. So once again, it's split kind of into middle class and working class. I got the feeling, in the sense that there was outrage amongst kind of journalists and other intellectuals who were saying, how dare he interfere in our election and sort of tell us what he thinks about it. And then basically a lot of the kind of more ordinary people who turned up to these events said, well, he was right. I feel he spoke for me. So I think that's an interesting example of how big the gulf has become, basically, between those who shape opinion, who shape the public sphere and shape politics, and ordinary voters, really, who are often drifting off in a different direction.
I suppose in the sort of alternative space, in terms of the alternatives to the mainstream party, there isn't just the AfD. There's also the BSW, run by Sarah Wagenknecht, formerly of the Left Party. Does that show that there is an appetite out there for change, that it's not necessarily driven by right-wing or far-right sentiment out there in the public?
It does, although I should say that her program does have kind of right-wing elements in it. That's what she was sort of trying to do, is capture the working class vote of people for whom the AfD is sort of too extreme, and who still want left-wing politics on things like labour rights and sort of classic trade union type topics. So she combined that with quite a strict stance on immigration. So, for instance, she was in favour of some of the tougher immigration laws that the Conservatives were introducing a few weeks ago. So it's an interesting combination of topics there. But and she did quite well with that in the Eastern regional elections last year in September, which was interesting to see, because the party is pretty much brand new. It was only founded in January last year. So she did remarkably well, given that it's a new party with very little infrastructure on the ground. But recently in surveys, her support has gone down a little bit. And I think that's due to the fact that it comes across as a very negative party, as a party that is kind of against things, but can't really quite formulate a kind of bigger vision as to where it's actually going to go. And so it's lost a little bit of support there. And I think the other issue is also that it's quite obsessed with Russia. So Sarah Wagenknecht herself very much looks towards Putin and Russia as responding to the Western aggression, basically, in what she sees as Western aggression in Ukraine. And she couldn't even say in a recent interview, when people asked her, are you glad that Ukraine still exists, as an independent entity? And she couldn't even bring herself to say yes. But instead sort of talks about, well, was it really worth the lives, that it cost? So that is an issue also for some voters who might be in favor of this kind of bridging of conservative with left-wing, ideas, but aren't necessarily entirely happy to go along with the Russia appeasement. So it's just a really idiosyncratic kind of program that isn't for everyone, which is, I think, why it's still quite small.
And I wanted to ask about the Green Party. I mean, they've been major players in the coalition. They too have fallen from grace quite spectacularly. Do you think that's mostly down to some of the policies around energy and how there's been a serious energy crisis, and yet this is not led to really much change in policy in Germany?
I think that's partially the reason, especially as that threatened to go quite far into people's own lives. So rather than just being a policy that sort of gets made at the top, the biggest example of that is the so-called heating bill that the government was trying to introduce. So basically phasing out sort of fossil fuel-based heating systems from people's homes. So immediately, this triggers the idea that the state's coming into your actual house and telling you how to heat it effectively, and especially in the East, that raised all sorts of heckles, because of this interference once again in people's private lives by the state, which people have experienced before and therefore respond quite strongly to. They wrote back on that quite significantly, and even the Green Chancellor candidate, Robert Habeck, basically now talks of this as a mistake. He does say it went too far too quickly, and he can understand why people responded so strongly to it. But nonetheless, there's a suspicion that this kind of thing might happen again, and, people are basically told how to speak, how to live their lives, how to be, and that is something that isn't particularly popular at the moment. So I think that's one reason. And then the other is just the increase in living costs as well. So people are already worried about things like very high inflation, cost of housing, groceries in particular have become very expensive. All of those kinds of things that ordinary people feel quite acutely. And if you then have a party in or near power that basically says, well, sacrifices will have to be made if you want to save the climate, the planet, then that's worrying people, because they will say, well, for your greater good, you might push policies through that perfectly well are going to damage my own sort of way of life and the way that I can afford or not afford certain things. So I think that's partially to do with that as well. And there's a sense basically that they will put ideology or their ideas before pragmatic politics. That's kind of how most people will put it to you. And they've also become I would say that they are certainly at the sharp end of a lot of the anger that is out there, because people associate them with wokeness, for lack of a better word, and anybody who's got any issue with that addresses it at the Green Party.
Now, most of the polls point to the conservative CDU coming back to power with Friedrich Merz as the likely next chancellor. He's ruled out any coalition with the AfD, which would surely imply working together with some of the parties that are in the current government. Is there a danger that people feel like, even with the change of leadership, that there won't be much change underlying it, that actually a change of that the elections won't actually mean anything substantial? Yeah,
I've written a lot about this recently, because I personally think that is a huge problem for democracy as well, when you can't legally and safely bring about a genuine and complete change of government or of administration when you want to. So, there's all sorts of issues with the first past the post system or with the presidential system in the US, but what you can still do is go out on voting day and vote for something quite different from what is currently in power, and then basically flip over the entire leadership. And that doesn't work in Germany at the moment. So Friedrich Merz has already admitted in the last sort of head-to-head that he had on TV with the current Chancellor Olaf Scholz that he will knock on his door first for a coalition. And that just seems so odd. You've got two candidates on TV basically giving you the visual impression by standing against each other, or, in a television studio, that you get a choice between the two, when you might well get both of them. So imagine, sort of Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch going head to head, and really, that you're going to get both of them possibly as Chancellor and Vice Chancellor or as PM and Vice PM or whatever in a coalition. It's just not the clear-cut choice that, voters want, especially now in a climate where they do want genuine change on a lot of issues. So it does, and one survey that I've seen recently even implied that Friedrich Merz might not just need the Social Democrats, but also the Greens. at the same time. So you'd effectively have the entire current government, again in a future government, only that it's led by the opposition leader. And that would leave only the political fringes, really, as the opposition, which seems an incredibly dangerous way of doing things, because anything then, think for, the next 3 or 4 years, these people will make politics together. Anything goes wrong with that, it's only the political fringes who will be in the opposition and saying what you're doing is wrong. So if people are unhappy with that, they will automatically associate any opposition with mainly the AfD, because they will have somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of the votes, probably, the way that the polls are looking. It's just an absolute mess, and I think, voters feel that frustration, and I'm not sure where this is going to go. So that really does deeply worry me, that at the moment, a lot of people are telling me, I don't know, I want change, but I don't know what to do to get it. Because the AfD will likely, as you say, not be part of any kind of coalition. So even people who vote for the AfD largely see that as a form of protest vote, and sort of want to increase their share to tell the existing parties that they need to do something different. But it's not a great situation. That's driven a lot of people to the AfD that wouldn't otherwise be there.
Katja Hoyer, thank you very much.
Thank you.